Salutare tuturor! Bine ați venit la o nouă dezbatere a formatului de conferințe Viral D. Astăzi am onoarea și bucuria să o avem invitată pe Mona Simion de la Universitatea din Glasgow. Ce vreau să spun despre Mona e, noi ne cunoaștem relativ de puțină vreme, dar am simțit așa o conexiune prin energia și disponibilitatea de a se implica totuși în spațiul filosofic românesc și mulțumesc pentru asta. Mulțumesc că ai acceptat să vii să ne prezinți cercetarea ta, care din punctul meu de vedere mi se pare foarte valoroasă pentru perioada în care am trecut, o perioadă de criză politică și aș putea spune chiar de o criză epistemică socială, ca să zic așa. Și de asta sunt foarte curios să văd ce ne prezinți. Vreau să vă mai spun că Mona a publicat recent o carte la Cambridge University Press cu titlul Resistance to Evidence și cred că deja din titlu ne face foarte curioși această carte. Așa că, Mona, mulțumesc încă o dată, ai cuvântul.
Mulțumesc frumos și mulțumesc de invitație. Sunt foarte bucuroasă să fiu aici și foarte emoționată pentru că n-am prezentat niciodată o lucrare în România și vă dați seama că e un moment special pentru mine. Din păcate nu pot prezenta în românește. Am încercat și vă spun că n-a ieșit prea bine și am zis că din respect pentru audiență, dar și pentru preciziunea conținutului, ar fi bine să prezint în engleză. Dar în Q&A, bineînțeles, putem vorbi în românește, că în conversație mă descurc mai bine decât la prezentări. That being said, so this talk is a combination of a bunch of topics that I've been working on lately, so it's not really just bits and pieces of the book, but rather some of the themes in the book and some of the research that I've been doing ever since the book came on the market. And the motivation, basically, the way in which I want to motivate the talk is to have you notice that there are a couple of paradoxes that are quite interesting about our epistemic situation. So one of them is the fact that even though we have fantastic ways of acquiring and communicating knowledge, which we didn't used to have when I was young, somehow paradoxically we seem to be inhabiting an ignorance crisis, which seems to be unprecedented, at least if we are to believe research results in social psychology. So this is not only a strange situation, but it's also a very high stakes situation in that I don't need to tell you the impacts that this kind of ignorance crisis has on democracy and in particular on our voting behaviors. I'm very happy that my talk is happening now rather than 2 weeks ago, I should say. Although maybe it would have been a bit more exciting, I guess, the stakes would have been higher. If you look in the research across disciplines, the two main triggers that are pointed out both in philosophical research and in empirical research at large for this ignorance crisis are, on the one hand, distrust in expertise, and on the other hand, overly trusting audiences taking up misinformation online. And of course, this put together, they're quite problematic. But the reason why they're epistemologically and ethically interesting is because they seem to be telling us something contradictory about the audience, right? About the knowers. It seems as though data are pulling in two opposite directions. The fact that people distrust expertise in an unprecedented fashion suggests that they're too skeptical and that we should teach them to be a bit more open to the testimony of experts. On the other hand, the fact that they so easily uptake misinformation online, for instance, suggests that they're too gullible. So which is it? Because, you know, if at least it were only one of them, then we would know what we need to treat. So if people would be too skeptical, we would be able to maybe deal with that with some sort of literacy courses in lower education. Or if they were to be too gullible, again, we could teach them digital literacy. But if both of them are going on, it's a mystery how to deal with this. So what we need is a diagnosis that explains this data in a unified fashion in order to be able to build up interventions. So here is a very popular diagnosis that's made quite a few waves and has been put forth in social psychology by Dan Kahan at Yale and his collaborators. So according to this hypothesis, the reason why the data are pulling in this funny way in opposite directions is because what is going on is neither that people are too skeptical nor that they are too gullible, is that people don't care about truth to begin with, but rather what they do when it comes to policy relevant facts, so things that are such that they are politically charged, for instance, the safety of vaccines or whether man-made climate change is happening. So this kind of topics that are politically charged. When it comes to these topics, people don't care about the truth. It's not that they're too skeptical or too gullible, is that they don't care about the truth to begin with. What they care about is stuff that fits their political identity. So the thought is that, for instance, in my case, because I'm a lefty, as soon as I hear someone saying that vaccines are not safe, I don't even take their testimony into consideration, not because it's false, which of course it is, but I don't care about that. The reason why I dismiss the testimony is because it doesn't fit well with my political identity, which is a leftist political identity. So the thought is that individuals then conform the assessment of information to a different goal, not to the truth goal, but to the goal of protecting their political identity. If you're a Trumpist, you want to reject any sort of evidence that climate change is happening or that vaccines are safe. If you're a lefty, you're going to reject evidence that whatever guns might be useful or that there might be something wrong with vaccines, no matter what their evidential value might be. So that's the thought. And of course, if you get that, of course, the result is going to be deepening political polarization, because now it's not only that some of us are leftist and some of us are right-wing, but now we also start believing completely different things and having completely different views of reality. So what is going on is not, strictly speaking, that we completely reject evidence for the stuff that we don't like, that doesn't sit well with our political identity, is that we just give it a lower evidential value. So when we have an expert on TV that says vaccines are safe, if we are a Trumpist, we're going to say, it's not that we're going to say, no, there's no evidential value to that. We're just going to assign less evidential value than it deserves. And the result of that is, of course, that we're not going to update our beliefs as we should in light of that testimony. Now, here is the really cool prediction of this theory that made quite a fuss and that annoyed me as well very much. If this theory is correct, it's not only that we all do it, so there's no difference between Trump voters and the rest of us. We all do the exact same thing. With me, for instance, it just happens that I believe that climate change is happening and vaccines are safe because I happen to be a left-wing person. If I had been a Trumpist, I would have believed the other things because I wouldn't have cared about the truth anyway. So it's not only that, but according to Kahan, what he argues he finds in his experiments is that we, those of us here in this room very likely, we are even worse at it. So we engage more than others in basing beliefs on political identity, motivated reasoning rather than on evidence. And you might wonder, really? Well, why would that be the case? Of course, that seems funny, right? Because the assumption always is, well, no, it's the other people, it's the uneducated one. If we only educated these folks better, maybe they wouldn't vote for Trump, right? Well, according to Kahan, it's the other way around. They are the ones that kind of conform their beliefs better to the evidence than we do. Why is that? Well, because Kahan says, with high levels of numeracy comes great skill in argumentation, which means that we are better at arguing for the beliefs that we want to have for ourselves, as it were. So when a belief sits well with my leftist political identity because I'm good at arguing, I'm going to be better at convincing myself of that belief than someone that doesn't have my level of education because they are not as well trained at arguing as I am. So if this hypothesis is true, first of all, we are all believing irrationally when it comes to policy-relevant facts. But furthermore, people in this room are very likely going to be among the worst of this kind. So that sounds pretty bad, right? So for the longest time, we thought that there is a solution for this ignorance crisis, and that is education. Well, it turns out that does more harm than good, so what should we do? So Kahan thinks that what we should do is foster intellectual virtues, such as open-mindedness. So he thinks that what his experiments show is that there's strong correlation between people who show indicators of open-mindedness and people who are less likely to vote in accordance with their political, to believe in accordance with their political identity. So that's Kahan for you. Now we're going to spend the rest of this time basically explaining why Kahan is wrong. So that's the good news. So just one thing to note, and that is just me just putting it out there. You know, like with any theory, you want it to be extensionally adequate, but you also want it to have other theoretical virtues, right? So you want it to have a high level of plausibility in light of other things that are widely accepted, for instance, right? So the problem with this theory is that it doesn't have that virtue. So its level of prior plausibility is very, very low. And that is the plausibility in light of other things that we know. Why is that? Well, because it implies a very widespread irrationality in the population. But what we do know really well from very well-established scientific results is that we are a highly successful species. And not only a highly successful species in practical terms, but also in epistemic terms. We do really well at science, right? Our scientific progress has been quite impressive. So one might wonder, is it really plausible to think that there are such widely spread levels of rationality in a species that is otherwise so epistemically successful? And of course you might think, well, but we know that there are all these biases and heuristics that we employ. We're sexist, all of us, we're racist, we have all these problems. Sure, but the reason why we study those things and we try to get rid of them is exactly because those are the exceptions. In all walks of life, we are very good epistemically. We deal very well with acquiring knowledge from the world. So in a nutshell, if we are to accept this theory, it better be the only theory that we can find, because this prediction that we are all widely irrational just sits not very neatly with the overall picture of our epistemic success. Here's another problem. Looking closely, and this is not something that I pointed out, but something that a colleague of Dan Kahan in social psychology pointed out, looking closely at the experimental setup, which I would like to encourage you to check it out yourself, you will note that it does not permit distinguishing between people who base their beliefs on motivated reasoning and people who base their beliefs on previously held beliefs. So basically what the experiment shows is just that there is strong correlation between a particular political identity and the kind of policy-relevant beliefs that you would expect. You have a lefty, they're going to believe vaccines are safe and climate change is happening. You have a right-wing person, they're going to believe the other way around. So there's strong correlation. That's all Kahan shows. But of course, we all know correlation is not yet causation, right? And what Tapin et al. Point out is that the same correlation exists in these folks with previously held beliefs that could also be used to support reasoning to the relevant policy beliefs. So for instance, it might be that I believe that guns are bad because I'm a lefty. But it might also be that I believe that guns are bad because I've seen a lot of countries that don't have easy access to guns, and you know, they're pretty safe, you don't have a lot of school shootings, and then you see other countries that do have easy access to guns, and then you see a lot of school shootings. So based on these beliefs that I have, previously held beliefs, which are based on, you know, just my life experience, it might be that that's why I believe that guns are bad, not because I'm a lefty. Hard to tell, because both of them are correlated. So what we need is basically a different experimental setup that variates the beliefs held and the political identity enough in order to establish what is the basing factor, right? What does the basing? Is the belief based on motivated reasoning, or is it just based on previously held beliefs? And now, leaving the social psychological picture aside, one thing that the experiment even furthermore cannot show, even if it does that variation that I mentioned, is the epistemic quality of these previously held beliefs, right? So I might have all kinds of beliefs about guns that I base my belief that guns are bad on. But one thing that the social psychologists cannot discover is whether these beliefs of mine are justified or not, because that's not the business of social psychology, that's the business of epistemology to assess. So the question is it the case that I believe that guns are bad because I'm a lefty and I like to believe it because it sits well with my political identity, or is it the case that I believe it because I have all these other beliefs about shootings in school and so on and so forth, which are justified by mere induction, for instance. I keep gathering evidence that suggests that in countries with gun control, you don't get school shootings, or in countries without gun control, you do get school shootings, and these are justified by merely watching TV. Right. So the question then is very hard to settle, first of all, with the kind of experiment that Kahan has run. Secondly, without an epistemologist on the side, to look at whether there is any justificatory evidence for those beliefs. Furthermore, further problems for Kahan. Many of you will be philosophers in the room, will be very happy to discover that the social psychologists again have made a mistake because they didn't engage in conceptual clarification. They should have had a philosopher with them. So here's a difference that Kahan ignores because Kahan is not a philosopher. There's a difference between engaging in motivated reasoning and being motivated to engage in reasoning. So when I engage in motivated reasoning, I basically base my beliefs on my wishes. That's what I do. I wish that left-wing stuff is true, and because of that, I'm going to believe all the things that the left-wingers say on TV, right? That is a basing relation that I'm describing. I'm describing a basing relation between a belief that whatever climate change is happening and my political identity, my wish that all lefty things are true. However, being motivated to engage in reasoning doesn't need to describe that basing relation. So let me give you an example. I, for instance, got excited about philosophy, so I was thereby motivated to go to the library, start reading a bunch of books, and reason about the stuff that I discovered in those books. There's nothing wrong so far, right? I haven't yet done anything wrong. I was motivated to go and reason by my wish to study philosophy, but I didn't base my resulting beliefs on that wish. I based them on thorough investigation. So the question is, which is it that Kahan mapped onto when Kahan told us that here in this room is crawling with politically motivated reasoners of the worst kind? And my claim is, well, the latter. Why? Remember what Kahan was saying. Well, we, highly educated people, we want to protect our political identity, and because we want to protect our political identity, we try to find good arguments to support the beliefs that match it. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It's exactly like me going and reasoning in the library because I like philosophy, right? Is it true that I'm trying to find good arguments for leftist beliefs? Absolutely. Insofar as they are good arguments, my beliefs will be justified. If they're not, if I'm just trying to ignore all evidence that goes against my beliefs, then yes, that's a problem. But if I take all evidence into account and I construct a good argument for the belief that I want to have, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, insofar as the belief is based on the argument, not on my wish that all lefty things are true. Finally, remember that Kahan, after telling us all that we're highly irrational, said that we should all undergo open-mindedness training. So I don't like virtues. I know that there are a few people in this department that do, so I would like to apologize in advance, but I will explain why I don't. I don't like virtues very much. So one thing that many people, even in virtue responsibilist literature, do believe is that virtues are not good for their own sake. They're good because they reliably lead to truth or to knowledge, depending on the variety of virtue theories that you are. So if you're someone like that, you already agree with me that virtues are not good for their own sake. In particular, virtues like open-mindedness are not good in environments that are really bad, epistemically, right? If you are a medical doctor, you should not be open-minded in an environment filled with anti-vaxxers. No, you should be as close-minded as possible. That's just exactly what you should be. In general, if you're an expert in a room filled with laymen, you should not be open-minded. You're the one who knows, right? So it's not a good idea to be open-minded in bad epistemic environments. It is, of course, a good idea to be open-minded in good epistemic environments. But that, in a way, trivializes the virtue of open-mindedness, because all it says is, well, when there is good testimony, take it up, and when there's bad testimony, don't take it up. So it's just a simple total evidence view. Rely on good evidence in belief formation. You don't need to talk of open-mindedness anymore. I should say, just a small caveat. One question that I get when I get at this point and I tell people that I don't like virtues is, well, but Aristotle was very clear that open-mindedness doesn't mean just ridiculously believing everything that you're told, but rather kind of figuring out this golden mean when you're just as open-minded as you should be, as it were, and just as close-minded as you should be. And I want to know I want to say absolutely, but that golden mean is just at the point, I want to argue, where you just respect your evidence. So when Aristotle says you should be as open-minded as you should be and as close-minded as you should be, the man basically just says respect your evidence. If the evidence is good, go with it. If it's bad, don't. So for that, we don't need the vocabulary or virtues. We can have the vocabulary of evidence and updating, and that's enough. As I argue in this wonderful book that Emilian was talking about in the beginning, the hypothesis that I'm entertaining and trying to argue for in the book is not that everybody who has funny beliefs about policy-relevant facts is rational. So that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm sure that claim wouldn't go very well with this audience in light of what has happened recently in the country. The hypothesis that I am trying to investigate is that often what we see in the world is a rational response to misleading evidence. That when we see people believing all kinds of bad things and we're wondering how did you end up having these beliefs, what is happening is rational response to a bad, polluted epistemic environment, an epistemic environment filled with misleading evidence. Again, this is not to say that there's no politically motivated reasoning out there. This is just to say it is not as widely spread as Kahan would put it, and thereby we don't need to assume that we're all highly irrational in order to explain the data that we started for. So if I'm right, we are not highly irrational. We just have some irrational people amongst us, and the rest of us, we are just garden variety cognizers who, of course, are slaves to our epistemic environment. If we are in an environment filled with misleading evidence, too bad. There's only so much we can do. Here's the thought. Remember that we started off by saying, isn't it funny that we have this wonderful sources of knowledge these days that we didn't used to have, and we have all this sophisticated ways of acquiring knowledge, communicating knowledge, and nevertheless we inhabit an ignorance crisis. Well, I want to say that is exactly the cause of the ignorance crisis. That what I am arguing in the book for is that we are inhabiting highly abnormal epistemic conditions. Our cognitive capacities did not evolve to use the internet. That's not how they evolved. They don't know how to defend themselves well against misleading evidence in an environment that is, first of all, so highly populated with evidence and misleading evidence, and in an environment where you don't really know when to stop inquiry. How many times do you need to Google it before you settle the question, right? This is not a normal epistemic environment. We evolved in an epistemic environment where we found out everything we needed to find out from our own perception and from our neighbors. That was how we evolved. We had very few sources. It was easier to figure out whether they're trustworthy or not because there were few of them and we knew them well. They didn't come through the internet from unknown places under pseudonyms. So there were very few sources and very easy to vet them. That's how our cognitive capacities evolved. It is highly unsurprising if they're failing in the current environment. That is what tends to happen when you move a trait or an artifact that has evolved in particular conditions, and you move it to an environment that's highly uncharacteristic for the way in which it has evolved, right? So for instance, if you take my heart and you put it in a vat with orange juice, now my heart will continue to be properly functioning. It will do the pumping, right, at the right rhythm and all that. But it will not be fulfilling its function. It will be pumping orange juice rather than blood in my stream, right? Similarly, if you take my cognitive capacities and you put them in an environment filled with misleading evidence, my cognitive capacities may well be doing things exactly as they should, but they will not be outputting knowledge because they are taking up misleading evidence, orange juice, as it were. It might even be that is not only a failure of function fulfillment, it's not just a failure of producing knowledge that we see, it might even be a failure in proper functioning, in that, as I said, insofar as we don't really understand how many sources we need to check before settling the question, we might be doing badly at it. We might not check enough sources or not check the right kind of sources because it's just a flood of information. So in order to see how easy it is to predict that this is the problem, let's just take a very simple view of learning that everybody agrees with and the correct view of evidence, which is mine. But it also has the advantage, it's a very simple and intuitive view of evidence. So learning, many people agree, is just updating beliefs or degrees of confidence on incoming information. That's all there is to learning. And let's ask ourselves now how these folks who form funny beliefs about policy-relevant facts are learning. How are they updating their beliefs? So here's something that, again, many people would agree with, is that justified updating of your beliefs is happens when you're properly updating on the evidence that you have, right? And I said that we're going to work just for the purposes of this talk with my view of evidence, because it's I think it's an intuitive view. Evidence are facts that increase the probability for the relevant proposition, right? So the fact that you tell me that it's going to rain tomorrow increases my probability that it's going to rain tomorrow. That's the view of evidence. That's why it is a piece of evidence for me for whether it's going to rain tomorrow or not, because it increases my probability that it's going to rain tomorrow, right? Similarly, or conversely, I should say, we have defeating evidence, so counter evidence. And what does this do? Well, shockingly, it lowers the probability of the relevant proposition or fact. So if you come and say that it's not going to rain tomorrow, then you lower my probability, the probability of it being the case that it's going to rain tomorrow. That's why your testimony that is not going to rain tomorrow is a piece of defeating evidence to my belief that it will, right? So now notice that all of this evidence and defeating evidence can be misleading. Misleading evidence, as the name suggests, is a type of evidence, right? So it's not a different beast. So it may well be that I inhabit an environment where all of my testifiers tell me that it's going to rain tomorrow. And these are people that I have no reason to doubt. They've been reliable in the past, they've never lied to me, and now they tell me that there's going to rain tomorrow. Of course, in this particular hypothetical scenario, they're all lying. But it is correct for me now to believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, because a bunch of people who are otherwise highly reliable, evidently not infallible, since they're lying to me this time around, but I have reason to trust them, they tell me it's going to rain tomorrow. I should form the belief that it's going to rain tomorrow. But if that entire evidence body is misleading, then what I end up with is a false belief. It's not knowledge, but it is highly justified. Is it plausible that this is what's happening to many people when it comes to policy-relevant facts? Of course it's plausible, because that's what political identity does. It builds a particular epistemic environment. I only talk to lefties. Obviously, if I were to try to find defeating information for my beliefs that guns are bad, I wouldn't even be able to find it, because I don't know anybody who believes that guns are good, even if I tried to find someone. So similarly, on the other side of the political spectrum, these folks talk to each other a lot. Look at the map, right? Look at the map of the US after the elections. It's very solid bodies of people that vote in the same way, right? That epistemically is predictable. What that tells me is that if you're a kid who grew up in Texas, and all people that you trust, and you trust them for a good reason, because, you know, in everyday matters, they tell you the truth. They tell you that there's milk in the fridge, and there's milk in the fridge. They tell you it's going to rain tomorrow, and it's going to rain tomorrow. And then they tell you that Trump is a good guy. What are you supposed to believe? You're supposed to believe exactly what they said. Do you have any defeating evidence? No, you don't, because you are in a huge bubble of people who believe exactly what you believe and keep telling it to you, right? Furthermore, what is even more problematic is, until now we discussed rebutting defeaters, right? So defeating evidence that comes and defeats beliefs by lowering the probability of the proposition by presenting evidence against it, right? So I discussed a case in which you come and I believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, but you come and tell me that it's not, so now I should lower my confidence that it's going to rain tomorrow. But defeaters, notably, can also be undercutters. So these are defeaters that come and tell you that a particular source is not to be trusted, right? So if everybody, think back to the kid in Texas, if everybody in their environment tells them you should not trust the CNN, these folks are lying, they're paid by Soros or what have you to tell you lies, that child is right not to ever open the CNN. So that you can see how the epistemic bubble builds even more neatly, in that now that child is completely isolated from any defeating information because the CNN as a testifier is completely undercut. So you might wonder, sure, the philosophy is all good and well, but why should we think that that's what's happening on the ground? So I ran a study with a colleague in sociology to try to understand vaccine hesitancy in Black and Caribbean communities in Scotland. So just as a background, boring white folks in Scotland got vaccinated 80-something%, as opposed to that, Black Caribbean communities only 40%. And what my colleague wanted to discover is why that is the case. I should say what is important for, as it were, the validity of these results is that my colleague herself is part of the community of Black and Caribbean Scots. So that means that she was quite well trusted, and these people welcomed her in her community and had long chats with her about their decision not to get vaccinated, which is important because I'm pretty convinced that if I had gone there, I wouldn't have had the same welcoming situation. So in a nutshell, overwhelmingly, these are the numbers. The reason why they didn't get vaccinated is because they distrust the safety of vaccines, not because they're lazy or religious or anything like that. They distrust the safety of vaccines. It's as simple as that. And the reason why they do that is, here are the reasons cited. First of all, distrust in the national health system. Why? Well, the national health system has a very bad history of discrimination against Black folk. So the difference between me and someone from the Black community in Scotland is that I have not, at least to my knowledge, been discriminated against by the NHS, but they have. What happened in the past is they were told that some medicine were safe for them, even though they had never been tested on Black folk, and it turned out that they were not safe for Black folk. And to the contrary, they would recommend some medicine to Black folk, but not to white folk, because they were trying to test its safety on them first. So with this kind of history of racial discrimination, it is perfectly rational for these people to not believe what the NHS tells them, especially in such high stakes and such uncertain situation as the COVID vaccine. So what is happening here is straightforwardly what we were discussing earlier. So these people have rebutting, defeating evidence to the testimony of the NHS. It doesn't matter how many times the NHS comes and tells them, because when a source is rebutted, it's undercut for you in that way. All evidence from that source is rebutted. So the NHS, as a matter of fact, didn't do anything special for them either, which is outrageous in itself. They sent the exact same flyer to me that they sent to the people in the Black community, even though I don't have the evidence of past discrimination that these people have. So they should have been addressed completely differently. That you know, it is not a very complicated philosophical truth that I'm uttering here. It's just tailor your discourse to the audience, right? But furthermore, even if the NHS had sent them 100 flyers instead of one, like they sent me, or 100 white doctors would have come at their door to tell them how safe the vaccine is, that would not have helped, because white doctors from the NHS are a source that is undercut in that past experience, inductive evidence suggests to these people that these are not trustworthy testifiers, right? It is irrational for them to take the vaccine under these circumstances. Furthermore, of course, there was a lot of disinformation. We see this in anti-vax communities in Romania a lot as well. A lot of disinformation about the vaccines that was circulated in the relevant communities. And you might think, well, why would they believe all these crazy things about chips being put in the vaccines and so on and so forth? Well, again, imagine that kid in Texas who's completely isolated from the CNN, because the CNN is undercut, and all the people that kid trusts, and trusts for a good reason, because they're, you know, their family, they come and tell him, really dangerous vaccine, it's got a chip in it. I want to say there is no way on any view of rationality to argue that that kid is irrational when he comes to believe these things. So in a nutshell, one thing to keep in mind for further research, and in particular empirical research, is the claim we all have the same evidence, why are these people irrationally not getting vaccinated, is a false claim. We don't all have the same evidence. I don't have the same evidence as you. I had my own life with my own inductive processes. You had your own life. You encounter all kinds of things that I didn't. So my evidential background is different from yours. And it is even more different from that of the Black community in Scotland. Now, finally, one thing that's important to say is sometimes it was irrational what they were saying, but it was predictably so, in that they were suffering from some epistemic anxiety. They just, as I said earlier, they just didn't know how to inquire into this anymore. Their community leader said, don't take the vaccines, it has chips in it. The NHS said, take it, it's super safe. They didn't know how to inquire. They didn't know what to do. So they threw their hands in the air and mistakenly thought that that's the safe option. All right, now, not everybody is like these nice Black folks in Scotland. Some people are really engaging in unjustified update or lack of update, right? So when you don't have any evidence that there's a chip in the vaccine, testimonial or otherwise, or when you don't have any defeating evidence to the safety, to the trustworthiness of the national health system, then you are irrational in not taking up that vaccine, right? But what is important, I guess, the take home from this talk is that the two problems ask for very different interventions. So what we need to do is exactly what I've done with Josephine. Go in these communities and figure out which is it. Is it that they were rationally responding to an environment where the evidential situation led them to believe these falsehoods? Or is it that they just were not rationally responding? These two problems, very different interventions. So we need to figure out which it is, one by one, case by case. When it comes to individual level interventions, in cases of lack of justification or of irrational beliefs, we need to focus on getting these folks to do epistemology better, basically, to update on evidence better. When it comes to environmental level interventions, then we don't need to do anything to these folks. They're perfectly fine. They're, functioning just like they should. Like my heart in the vat with orange juice. We just need to change the orange juice to make it blood again. So we need to make sure that their evidential environment is of the right kind. So here are some examples of environmental interventions. I'm not going to, break any new ground here. I'm just telling you things that we already know work from the empirical literature. So if we want to work on the environment, we don't need to foster open-mindedness in folks. That's hard, and if I'm right, it doesn't work. Here are some interventions that we already know work. So first of all, we need to tailor the evidence to our audience. It's as simple as that. If I know that I'm addressing a group of people that very likely have misleading evidence in their environment, I need to come with better and more evidence to counteract this one, to defeat it, right? So if I know that I'm talking to people who, for instance, don't trust the NHS, what should I do? Should I come with 600 white NHS doctors to talk to them? No, that's not going to work. What I need to do is bring better evidence. People that they do trust should come and support the NHS message. I need to work with the community leaders and convince the community leaders to carry my message that the vaccine is safe. Or get some of those black doctors on TV because they're more likely to be trusted than the white folks. It is just what it is. So basically enhance the quality of the evidence that they receive for the truth claim such that it defeats all the misleading evidence that they have for the falsehoods that they believe. It's as simple as that. It's also good to have a better online epistemic environment cleanup, right? So what we have now are these famous fact checkers, and we have plenty of evidence that suggests that they do absolutely nothing to change people's beliefs. And it is predictable on epistemological grounds that they do absolutely nothing. Why? Well, if I believe that vaccines are not safe, I see a line that says vaccines are not safe on the internet, and then the fact checker says, this is false, vaccines are safe. The epistemic situation is just one in which I have one testifier that says they're safe, and one that says that they're not safe. There is no reason for me just yet to believe either. I have two sources, one says that P, one says that not P. I can throw my hands in the air. So fact checkers are bound to fail. However, one thing that we could do is, first of all, have fact checkers that utter explanations, and secondly, have disinformation checkers instead of fact checkers. So checkers that try to figure out how people are misled into losing knowledge rather than merely checking for what is true or false, and explaining to people how they are being misled. So here are a bunch of things that we already know since Stalin. This has been done and known since Stalin. The most efficient disinformation campaigns are not done with blunt falsehoods. People are not stupid enough to fall for blunt falsehoods. You start off slowly with claims that are true, but carry implicatures that are false, so imply things that are false, right? So we know from Grice that in cooperative communication, people follow a bunch of rules, conversational rules of, for instance, rule of quality, don't convey what you believe to be false, or of quantity, be as informative as required, or of relevance, be relevant, and manner, be as clear as possible. And these are rules that we all follow in cooperative conversation, and because we usually follow them, hearers usually expect that we will, right? So what happens when we don't follow these rules is hearers are misled into believing all kinds of things that we don't, strictly speaking, say, but they get communicated pragmatically, and that we know from Grice as well, right? So here are a bunch of examples that we don't know from Grice. So here's a breach of relevance. you see on TV people saying things like, there is disagreement about climate change or the safety of vaccination in the scientific community. Breach of relevance. Why? Well, it is true that there is disagreement in the scientific community, but what is not true is that there is significant disagreement that is newsworthy. So when you see this claim on the news, what you believe is that there is disagreement that's significant enough to be on the news. So then you get scared and you throw your hands in the air, you don't know what to believe anymore, because widespread significant disagreement warrants belief suspension. But the claim is true just because there are a couple of nut jobs in Texas who don't believe that that climate change is happening, right? So it's not the case that there's significant disagreement in science about any of this, right? But you can see how nothing false had been said. But most folks, if you say that on TV, the takeaway message will be that there's significant disagreement in science and that we don't know what to believe anymore. And these are all claims that have been made by politicians, I should say. I didn't come with the names. Here's another one. Vaccines have very bad side effects. What is this? A breach of quantity. It is true that vaccines, when they do have bad side effects, they're very bad. But the probability, so it happens very, very rarely. The probability is extremely small. Why is it a breach of quantity? Because you just omit to say, you're not as informative as you should be, right? So what's the take home? If you say this to my grandmother, vaccines have very bad side effects, my grandmother is, oh my God, let's not take the vaccines anymore. Of course, as I said, probabilities of them, very low. Here's another one. I hope I'm not getting people to stop getting vaccinated with these slides, because these are quite powerful, right, these messages. I think that I would have fallen for quite a few of this, especially the last two. I think they're harder to track even for people who know their Grice. If I'm not mistaken, there's no evidence for climate change. Trivially true. It's not hard for this claim to be true. But what you take home is, for all I know, there is no evidence. But that's not what has been said, right? And another one, it's not clear that we don't know that vaccines are not safe. I have no idea what that said. We don't track many negations. We're not good at that. You hear that, what do you take home? Something along the lines of, probably the evidence concerning the safety of vaccines doesn't tell either way, or something like that, right? But that's not what has been said. Only God knows what has been said, because I wrote it and I still don't know what it says. So I proposed in the past and in the book that if we conceptualize this information more usefully than we do now, where we think this information is just falsehoods spread around with the intention to mislead, but this information is not just falsehoods. Indeed, as I said, even Stalin knew that the best disinformation campaign you don't run with falsehoods, you run with ignorance generators. And those need not be, strictly speaking, falsehoods. You can generate ignorance with pragmatic content. So the upshot of this is that if this information is content that generates ignorance, the upshots are that it's much more ubiquitous than the dictionary definition allows, that defines it as falsehood. But more importantly, that if we want to clean up the online environment, we need to train an AI to track pragmatic phenomena, which shouldn't be that hard, because we train first-year philosophy students to understand Grice. So it should really not be very complicated for AI. And now finally, should it be the case that there's also this irrational folk, right, who really, no matter how many pieces of evidence from trustworthy sources you present them with, they're just not going to fix their beliefs. Well, again, we don't need any open-mindedness training. We know already that we can enhance our cognitive capacities in a bunch of ways. We can do cogent reasoning training in schools, so instead of just teaching folk, as it were, critical reasoning, where we just teach them what follows from what, we teach them cogent reasoning, where we also teach them how to uptake evidence well, so not just to run valid arguments, right, from premises that are assumed. We know how to do cognitive flexibility training. Cognitive flexibility is the truth behind open-mindedness. Cognitive flexibility is this kind of capacity whereby you're not dogmatic. So you are willing to consider other pathways. So as soon as there's some evidence for a belief that you already have, against a belief that you already have, you're willing to consider it. You're not dogmatic about it. And finally, let's train folks in the pragmatics of language, because that, as I said, if we train first-year philosophy students, we should be able to train the population at large as well. That's it. I'm sure I'm late. Sorry about that.